good evening again, or good day, good morning. It's Professor Reznick again. Today I want to talk about two interesting things. One is the connection to what we have been doing heretofore in a concept called modernism, and also its connection to another concept which you probably have run into, postmodernism. Modernism is a way of thinking that asserts that particular ideas or particular kinds of tools can be used by human beings to enable those human beings, those knowers, to understand what is really going on in the world or what is really going on in nature. Now, these tools may be mathematics, say geometry in economics or algebra in economics. There may be particular kinds of painting in art. There may be particular kinds of grammar in language. There may be rationalism and empiricism in philosophy. So whatever they are, these particular tools are asserted to be necessary for a knower to conquer time and space by revealing to the knower what is universally true, that conquers space, and what is eternally true, that conquers time. So modernism is a way of thinking that searches for and finds the absolute truth. Some philosophers have linked modernism to despotism and tyranny. And again, that person I mentioned to you the last couple of times, Foucault, is one who has argued that what occurs in modernism is that the few have been able to transform their particular set of tools and the knowledges produced with those tools into the theorizations or discourses or what he calls the formations of the day that order everybody else's behavior. That's why he's such a controversial and interesting thinker across the 20th century. Their ideas, their tools, order our behavior because these other individuals assert that their tools and their ideas are the true discourses, the true theories of the day. So, if it's the truth, if one accepts that assertion, then those true theories and tools dominate and can eliminate all other and different ways of thinking and different ways of using tools that are determined not to be true or not to be reasonable when compared to the true discourse of the day. Note the implications here for Marxian theory, since that's been deemed not to be true, and the tools of Marxian theory, its value theory, not to be correct, and hence it gets demoted because other ways of thinking are asserted to be the truth. It's the lesson of Foucault. So rather than having reason and experience liberate human beings from ignorance, which was the hope of the Renaissance, in which modernism grew up, they are used to force individuals, that is reason and experience, are used to force individuals into accepting the declared true discourse of the day. So the few use their power, in one way or the other, to make the majority's thinking conform to the ideas of the few. So they're despots in that sense, the few. Instead, we should acknowledge the different discourses that human beings produce with their different relative truths, yielding their different determinations on our lives, the lesson of Mr. Rorty. And that's all we ever have. We have all these different truths and these different consequences. And that's what we need to be aware of and conscious of so that we can choose amongst them based upon their different consequences on our lives, not based upon that one is true and is not true, because there's no way, as we just have shown in the last two presentations, to go about ascertaining that. Rather, we have these different truth claims, these different consequences, and that's what we choose amongst. That's what we have to recognize, and that's what we have to evaluate. But we always have to recognize and evaluate these different consequences are always occurring within a particular theory, because there's no way to step out of that. So the way we evaluate the different consequences is always relative to a particular theory. I want to now move and discuss more this notion of overdetermination, this notion of dialectics, and Marx's own presentation of his method, which I've asked you to look at. The notion of overdetermination, which we've talked about, refers to how something exists. I'm going to use a different word, how something is constituted. And it exists, or it is constituted, as a site of different determinations that literally combine together to produce it. So I want to put on the whiteboard, again, a diagram which I put on a couple of presentations ago, and explain this notion of overdetermination. So let me turn to this. The idea is that in the world there's an infinity of different, I'm going to call them processes after Marx. And I'm going to divide them again into these four categories. And this is arbitrary. You can divide them any way you want. I'm going to use this particular kind of taxonomy. So economics, again, to remind you, has got to do with the production and dissemination of wealth. Politics has got to do with the production and dissemination of ordering of human behavior. Culture has got to do with the production and dissemination of all the different meanings that we produce about life. And of course, nature has got to do with all the biological, chemical, and so forth changes that occur in life. So the argument is that the society or the world, the term that was used in Marx's day, materiality, reality, so these are all synonyms, is a result of the coming together of these different political, economic, cultural, and natural determinations. So we have the economic, we have the political, economic processes, production, dissemination of wealth, political processes, the ordering of human behavior, the laws and the rules that we establish in society, all the cultural processes, how we think and the different forms of our thinking, and of course, I don't want to leave it out, all the natural processes. Sun up in the sky, rainfall, blah, 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 blah. All those come together and literally create in here society. That dot is the site of all these different causes, these different determinations. Okay, that's the notion of overdetermination. There's an infinity of them. So as I told you before, the prefix over is a poetic way of trying to say there's an infinity of these determinations. So what's true for society is also true for anything in society, any person, any institution. Anything we can think of using this notion of causation is a site, a locus of these different causes that come together and literally create it. Let's use another term. We can say that the political, economic, and cultural and natural processes are the conditions of existence of a particular site, in this case, society. So we can say that in the United States today, what are its conditions of existence? Well, they would be the political, the natural, the economic, and of course the cultural processes that come together to literally create the society, the United States. Okay. What's true for the site society in terms of this notion of overdetermination is again true for all of these processes. So if we just look at, let's take economic, if we ask how this thing is constituted, how it exists, well, it exists, of course, as the result of the impact of society on it, but also as politics and culture and nature. And we can do the same for any one of these. So if we ask how politics exists, it would be economics, of course natural, and of course society, and of course cultural. Well, you can see that this is a mess. So from the perspective of overdetermination, if I continue to do this, I'm going to have an infinity of these different crossing lines, and that's what the overdetermination asserts, that this society is a mess of, it's a chaotic entity of these interacting determinations. And then you ask, well, what do you do as a human being when you're confronted with this mess? What we do then is we choose one, at best, set of processes to begin to understand the mess. Some people choose economics, other people choose politics, other people choose nature, physicists, other people choose culture, music. These are the different entry points that theorists deploy to begin to bring order and understanding to theorize, to explain the mess. So what an entry point is a particular kind of way that a person uses to begin to order these overdetermined sites, to begin to make sense of them. And of course there are many, many, many different entry points, that is, many, many different theories deploying these different ideas to make sense of society. And these different entry points then distinguish, they identify the different ways, the different theories that we use to make sense of society. Marx uses class, that's an economic process to begin to make sense of society. That's his particular entry point, and that's to be compared and contrasted with the other entry points that people use. So that's the first idea. Second, let me go back to, I'm going to erase this mess that is society, to go back and talk about the following. We have society as this kind of site of politics, economics, culture, and nature, and so forth, etc. So everything comes together to produce this society that we just did. All of these determinations are different. These political, economic, these cultural, and of course these natural. They're all different. So society is the result of these different determinations, and we can use another word to capture this. Society exists in contradiction, and what contradiction refers to here is the different pushes and pulls that are present in society resulting from all of these different processes. So the result of overdetermination of how something exists is the, or I should say, are the contradictions present in that particular entity, whatever it is. Let me give you a different example of this. Something that may be relevant to your lives right now. How do you explain the particular choices of an individual for taking one course over another at the university? Well, I'm examining now an individual, you or me, that makes a choice to take a particular course. We're pushed in the direction of taking this course as a result of all kinds of open and hidden parental pressures. So that's a set of determinations that operate on us, whether we're aware of them or not. It's what our parents want us to do and have wanted us to do from the time that we were born. But that's not all. Then there are cultural determinations that push us to take a particular course as a result of all kinds of ideas and experiences of what is and what is not popular in the society at any moment in time. But that's not all. The courses that we take are also a result, complex result, of the rules and regulations of the university, as well as who's teaching that courses, who's a popular teacher, who's not, and so forth. Also, the economy shapes us in all kinds of ways in terms of the courses that we take, because of the vague ideas we have that if we take a particular course, that may help us get a job when we graduate, so that we can do well in the future. But these same forces also push us in a different direction. We resist and we rebel against parental pressures. We struggle against university rules. We always are responding to our changing views and experience of what subjects seem to interest us and what subjects do not. We refuse to become prisoners of an unknowable future. In other words, we're conflicted. We take courses, we make a choice, we have a desire to take a course, but at the same time we don't want to take that particular course. And the result of all of these we exist in contradiction. And as a result of those contradictory forces upon us, we take a particular action, we make a particular choice. In other words, the contradictions yield our behaviors, what we do and what we don't do, what courses we enroll in and what we don't enroll in. And you can apply this kind of logic to all of our choices over our entire lifetime. So putting it all together, the society is both a result of these different determinations, but the society also comes back and shapes all of these. So there is a mutual interaction between society and its political, economic, and cultural, and of course natural processes. Just like there's a mutual interaction between us and our parents and the professors and the courses that we take and so forth, etc. They shape us and we shape them. And again, to go back to make sure we understand, in this mutual effectivity, an entry point plays the role of beginning to try and understand, to explain this complex mutual effectivity. That's why it's so important in the theories that we deploy. Next step in this. The notion of overdetermination means that the influence of any entity upon any other is itself constituted. Let me give you just a concrete example of this, because this point is rather important. I'm going to take something that's popular today. This may not be in the news when you hear these lectures, but let me just take something today. We have let me take 3 events. We have something today called the crisis in Egypt. As I talk to you today, this has been in the news for the last couple of weeks. Okay, so that's the crisis, and I'll call that event C. Now, event A, right now, seems to be the most important cause on the crisis in Egypt, which event A is the lack of democracy in Egypt. If you hear the news, you read the papers, invariably this is the most important cause in the crisis in Egypt. Okay? And other causes which are there are thought to be secondary. Let me take B, the unequal distribution of income in that country. Okay? Now let's go back to overdetermination, because see if this is see if we understand what it is. This is a good example to test that. Overdetermination is saying the crisis in Egypt is a site of determinations, fascinating and interesting and so forth. And from the perspective of the notion of overdetermination, those influences are infinite in character. There's no question that the lack of democracy has had an impact on that crisis. But the influence of A on C, this heavy line here, from the perspective of overdetermination, is itself a complex product of B and C and a whole bunch of events that have yet to be examined. In other words, this causation itself is not independent of how B impacts C. And let me take another one right over here. Let me put D. This would be the class structure in Egypt, the Marxian contribution. This too complexly affects A, and hence how A is constituted creates, literally, its impact upon C. So this arrow here, what we think is more important, what we think has this bigger quantitative and or qualitative impact upon C, is itself a product of how B and D and E and F and G and so forth created. So this is not independent of these other causations. By the way, nor is the class structure independent of this lack of freedom, or is the income distribution a product. They mutually constitute one another. So this kind of idea, in a sense, demotes what we think is important today. Once we understand that that which is important today, that impact, that effectivity, is itself caused. Okay? So the impact of the lack of democracy on Egypt is itself caused by the unequal distribution of income, the class structure in Egypt, and a whole bunch of other kinds of cultural and natural and political processes that other theorists are going to introduce, because that's what theory does. It's continually discovering new kinds of determinations in the world, and once we discover them, we understand that that which we thought was important today gets demoted by these new kinds of processes that the theorists introduce with their different kinds of points of entry. So the upshot of all of this is that entities, no matter what they are, in this case A, B, C, and D, are not independent of one another. That's what overdetermination means. Okay? That independent entities can't exist. Why? Because each is the site of determinations emanating from all the others, and what is true for any one is true of them all. So they only exist as they literally constitute one another. They only exist in relationship to one another. If that's the case, then they can't be causally ordered to say that one is more important or less important or of equal importance. To say that one is more or less or equal importance to the other presumes independence so that you can causally order them. If they are not independent, you can't do that. The implication of this is that there are no, from the perspective of overdetermination, there are no essences in the world. No process in the world is immune from causation, because that's what an essence is. An essence is something, it's like a god. An essence is immune from causation. It reproduces itself. From the perspective of overdetermination, there are no essences in the world. And again, that's because things only exist in relationship to other things. Everything is both cause and effect, and an effect. So, overdetermination is an anti-essentialist approach to theory, whether that theory be in epistemology or in society. We've already discussed the anti-essentialist perspective of overdetermination in terms of rationalism and empiricism. But you can see that the anti-essentialist approach is also arguing there's no ultimate, most important determining factor in a society like the crisis in Egypt. However, within Marxism, within the tradition, there is a kind of theoretical essentialism, which is very, very important, and I want to spend one moment on it because it's in your reading and it's unfortunately in Marx's text as well. And it's called economic determinism. So let me just spend a moment on that because it's so important. Within the Marxian tradition, not only is there the essentialism of rationalism and empiricism that Marx and others struggled against, but that's present within that tradition as well. But there's also this essentialist theory of society in which economics is deemed the most important cause. Okay. Marx, and especially Engels, had the following idea. They thought society could be decomposed into the following kind of metaphor. At the base of society, so let me draw this, at the base of society was economics. And the rest of society was built upon this base. So here was economics, the foundation of society, the ground for society. And up here was everything else, which they called the superstructure, politics and culture. So politics and culture rest upon, are caused by economics. You can see where this is going to go. In economics, there were two parts of the economy which were the ultimate cause of all of economics and the ultimate cause, hence, of the superstructure. In here, I'll put it down here, in the base, there were two. One was relations of production, and the other forces of production. Two aspects of the base determined the rest of the economy, you know, the circulation, the markets, and so forth, which in turn then determined everything else. So these, you can see these are no minor causes. Relations of production had to do with who owns what. So the distribution of ownership over the means of production, the tools, the factories, was the relations of production. The forces had to do with how we produce, the technology of society. So Marx, and especially Engels, argued that the interaction between the relations and the forces of production determines the economy, which determines everything else. And this is called, in the literature, economic determinism. Notice the adjective. There is an ultimate causation in society, which is that of economics. In everything else, how we, the music that we play, the literature that we see, the advertising, the production and circulation of goods, is ultimately grounded in the relations and forces of production. That was so important that they put a label on this, and it was called the mode of production. So the idea was that the mode of production is the ultimate cause. It's the essence of society. So if you understand how the mode operates, the relations and forces, you understand everything. That's a powerful theory. That's really modernism. You have now the two essential aspects and the tools with which and by which to figure out what is really going on. That's their modernist theory. Notice, however, that violates the dialectic, this notion of overdetermination. Because we've found the ultimate causes. We've found the two essences, relations and forces. So even when Engels and Marx went to work in presenting this, it wasn't too long after they did this. If you remember correctly, Marx had just died. And so someone writes Engels and says to him, Mr. Engels, as students of history, referring to Engels and Marx, I'm paraphrasing because I don't exactly remember it, but you, as students of history, you understand that the politics and culture of society shape the mode of production. I mean, causation goes that way too. It would be silly to think that the mode of production, our relations and forces, are independent of the way we think, our laws and rules and so forth. And Engels writes back and says, you're right. I understand that what I think is this ultimate cause is itself caused ed. And he had to say that because Engels was a student of the dialectic. But then Engels answered that letter by saying, I understand this, but I think how this causation works is determined in the last instance by economics. And that's been called ever since determination in the last instance by economics. But this is a trick that Engels played, because he accepts the critique that the mode of production is an effect of the superstructure, so he accepts that. But then he attacks it by saying that the way the superstructure causes the mode of production is itself caused by the mode of production. Okay? So, to make a long story short, he's still affirming a kind of essentialism. And that problem, that economic determinism, has been a problem within the Marxian tradition ever since Marx and Engels presented it. So for the last 130 years, people have been struggling over this, and that's in your reading. And it has very, very important implications across the 20th century in the these socialist experiments that were adopted starting with the Soviet Union, many of which, if not all of which, adopted this kind of economic determinism. The last part of this lecture, what I want to talk about, which I said we would, is this few pages in which Marx presents his method. That's in the assigned reading. So I want to talk about, because it's a good summary of how what we have done heretofore bears upon this. And in this reading, Marx presents two kinds of concretes: the thought-concrete and the concrete-real. The wording is difficult here. The thought-concrete is a result of theorizing. So you think of people thinking, and they produce a theory of society. He calls that the thought-concrete. The concrete-real refers to reality, or the word that was used in his day, materiality. Okay? Marx theorizes the concrete real as a totality, as a site of determinations emanating from political, economic, and cultural and natural processes. Hence, he produces a particular thought concrete of the concrete real, which is, I'm going to use not his language, our language, which is an overdetermined totality, which exists in contradiction. I'm using what we just talked about. Okay, that's the way Marx produces his thought concrete of reality. So once again, reality is the site of these different determinations which are pushing and pulling in different directions, hence it exists in change. One response to these contradictions, that's one response to the diverse determinations which emanate from society for materiality on us, is our thinking. So the concrete real feeds back and affects how we think. I mean, what do we have now? We put it together. We produce thought concretes as human beings about how society and nature exist, how it impacts us, and so forth. Okay? So our thinking, our thought concretes, which are a result of our thinking, help to create the concrete real in two ways. Our thinking is part, or our thought concretes are part of the concrete real. So to think and to change the way we think shapes the concrete real, because we are changing one aspect in the concrete real, which is our thoughts, our theories. But it also changes everything else in the concrete real, because everything else is a complex effect of how we think. So to think and to change our thinking impacts society, or this concrete real, in these two ways. It changes something out there, and it changes everything else out there, because everything else interacts with our thinking, and hence it creates impacts upon us. So we're left with the following idea, which the ceaseless dialectic of life, what's this called? To change a thought concrete, which don't forget what that is now, to change a particular theorization of the world, is to change the world in these two ways, and that change in the world feeds back to change our thinking, and you have this ceaseless dialectic of life in which thought concrete and concrete real shape one another. Neither one is independent of the other. Hence, neither one can serve as the essence of the other, and that's another attack on rationalism and empiricism. And that's the end of today's presentation.